we're going to let Helen do a lot of the talking today because really that's the most, I think, powerful endorsement for the campaign and for podcasting advertising when it's done well. So I'm going to initially hand over to Helen, and then she will give us the context of the campaign, and then we'll chip in from there.
Fantastic, thank you. Do we have a clicker? Oh, there's the clicker. Just there. That big one there. What could possibly go wrong? Hello, everyone. I'm Helen. Thanks for having us. I'll start with kind of what I do a tiny bit. So I'm the head of marketing, institutional marketing for ANZ. ANZ's a bank. Hopefully you know that bit. And that is kind of point one, which is our challenge was never awareness. Yeah. Now, institutional is the very largest end of the client base. So we bank government departments, we bank multinationals, we bank the really, really big organisations. Yeah? And that's really a relationship business. So the chairman of the board, the chief executive, the CFO, all the C's, you know, the CFO, the treasurer, it's these kind of people, and the people who influence their buying decisions. So that's my audience. Yeah. They know who ANZ is, but they are really busy people, and my job is to get in front of them. So let's talk a little bit about how we do that. So 2 years ago, let me take you back 2 years, I came into this job, and I've done a lot of like mass advertising. Like, I'm a retailer, and they gave me this job, and I'm like, oh crap. I didn't say that to the boss after, but you know, what do we do? How do we organise this? And what I learned was that within the bank, we have this massive intelligence around our economists. So these are the guys who know what's happening geopolitically, economically. They're really smart, bright people. They're across the globe, and they've got all these smarts, and they write them in these really long-form reports that seriously nobody reads, especially not if you're a chief executive, because you're really, really busy. You've got a short attention span, and you have no time and no interest. That's why you have got the job that you've got, right? So that's where the podcast came in. So we set up a daily markets podcast. The five things you need to know about the global economy and markets in under 5 minutes, followed by a deep dive. If that sounds like your kind of thing, check it out. It's cool. Then we could do a whole other conversation about how we produce a daily markets podcast daily, globally. And big thanks to Ralph and to Andy for all of your help in getting that set up. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about what happened next. So we set this podcast up. We ran it for about 6 months and let it get its kinks out. And what we learned in that 6 months was that there was really significant organic growth. And people, once they started listening to this podcast, listened a lot. So they're listening 3 times a week on average, and they're listening for 8+ minutes. Wow. Yeah. So that beats hands down basically anything else I could do. So that was really interesting. The problem that we had, though, was how to scale. So if you think about what those people's daily lives are like, they're getting up at 4:30 in the morning or something ridiculous. I don't know what they're doing. I'm asleep at this point. They're exercising, and then they're on from 6:30 until whatever time their dinner finishes at night. Yeah, and we've got to find a way of intercepting that really time-poor, extremely high-value audience. So we could grow organically to a point, and then we got stuck. And that's when Ralph introduced us to Andy, and we started talking. I talked to our mainstream media agencies, and what we got there was reach, but not specificity, not the targeting. Yeah. And the first thing that we really learned was we're not interested in talking on channels that aren't audio. If those people aren't already listening to podcasts, we're not going to convince them, with good though 5 in 5 is, we're not going to convince them to start to listen to podcasts. So we're not in the business of growing your category. We're in the business of finding the people who are already interested and getting in. And that's really where you guys came in. So I'll stop there, and you can keep telling the story, Andy.
Yeah, so as Helen said there, I mean, half the problem when you're promoting a podcast is actually finding people that are already active podcast listeners. If you promote it across other channels, it might be relevant for them, they might be interested in it, but if they're not podcast listeners in general, then they're never going to listen to it. So where you should always start is obviously the podcast medium. So that's one side, but then the level up is obviously that caliber of audience that Helen was just talking about. So that's why it's even more important on this case to know exactly where the ads were going and basing the targeting on the content itself rather than just, business category, understanding the content so that we could be sure there was minimal wastage. So the way that we did this is obviously speak to every single network in Australia, all the sort of smaller publishers and independent podcasters as well. And then the media plan that we recommended was based purely on the content and thinking about these conversions. We're after repeat listeners. This is not just a one-time download that we're after. This is people that we want to be part of this 5 and 5 community and engage with this content regularly. So that was why it was so important in this case to base it on the content rather than just thinking about the reach metrics. So we did this in a few ways through 30-second ads, which we created a few of, and host reads, and I'll let Ralph come on to that in just a second. But the reason you see this screenshot of the Triton Digital Ranker and the top ranking business podcast is just to highlight how different these podcasts within that ranking are. So you've got She's on the Money there at the top, and that is a great podcast with a huge audience, part of iHeart, but for this audience, it's not quite right. All you have to do, you could open up your phone now, look at the topics, and you'll see that it's not quite right. It's a personal finance podcast. The topics are more of an informal conversation, whereas you scroll down and you see Chanticleer there was absolutely perfect, part of 9 for this one, and we sponsored that in the end. So even though these are all from different networks across Australia, we look and we review every single one based on the content itself. You look at the hosts, you only have to listen to one for 2 minutes to know if it's right for you. But you can go down to this level, even through category buys. You should be trying to look at, of the 30 podcasts within that category, where are my impressions going? Is that content right? And trying to be as specific as possible with that targeting to make sure that you're on it. And then, when I'll hand over to Ralph now, making sure that the creative is also contextually relevant so that it doesn't feel jarring to the listener. It feels like it's part of that listening experience.
Okay, so the creative. So the key to the success of any audio campaign is understanding how listeners listen. And that's the case with radio, knowing when to cut through and stand out. And in the case of podcasting, how to fit in, and how to be as much of a fan of the podcast as the listener is. So the 30-second ad I'm going to play you first is a good example of that. For a start, we've used Bernard, who's the host of the 5 and 5 podcast. We've used his voice. That helps remove the agenda that's inherent in a lot of advertising in audio. We're so good at spotting the agenda and someone who's insincere and someone who doesn't really belong in the environment of a podcast because we're listening so intently and so our engagement is so high. So using him, also acknowledging the fact that we know that he is on a podcast talking about business whilst promoting a podcast that is inherently about business. So it's like trying to sell beer to a wine while someone's drinking wine or vice versa. And we have to make sure that we acknowledge that, because if we come in implying that you should be listening to a different podcast, that audience is going to go, well, what are you talking about? So acknowledging the fact that they're listening and we're advertising on a weekly podcast, but there's a need for a daily update, a short, sharp daily update. So we made that sort of an important part of the messaging. So I'll play you the first ad just to give you a little bit of context, and then we'll talk a little bit about it.
I just click it and it should play.
Bernard Hickey here, and the one thing I love more than a weekly business podcast is a daily markets podcast. But you need both. A show like this one to get your in-depth analysis, and 5 and 5 with ANZ to give you a quick daily update on the market moves and data released overnight.
The consumption outlook for the US.
Beijing views copper.
The board expressed concern.
The real stars are ANZ's global team of economists and strategists with their fingers on the pulse. So hit the link in the description and start your day with 5 and 5 with ANZ.
And then a random sound effect, which was part of the rest of the podcast. But there's a lot going on in there as well, just with the referencing the ANZ stars. This is a branded podcast, and already, a lot of the times when you're advertising or you're trying to set up a branded podcast, you feel like you're starting further behind the track because people look at the brand and go, okay, well, there's an agenda here clearly, so do I really want to spend my next 10 minutes or whatever with that brand? But by talking about the benefit of having ANZ involved, i.e. access to their thinkers, their economists, and that is actually a benefit, the fact that ANZ is actually involved in this podcast and part of the content. So acknowledging that head on and making that a part of the ad was also important. Then we made a number of ads as well in that campaign so we could cover a lot of the benefits without the listener getting fatigued or thinking that they'd already heard that ad and start zoning out. We're constantly zoning in and zoning out of every creative message. Plus, in a podcast, you have the option of skipping it altogether. So to make sure that we're coming in with slightly different language at the beginning of every ad and giving the listener a chance to go to process it and reappraise it and go, should I be listening to this one as well? This is different, and getting a new message. So that was the benefit of having multiple executions. When we created the host read scripts, we do what we do with all our host read ads and listen to the show and understand the language and the dynamic between the host or hosts. In this case, we wrote a script that felt pretty much the same way that they would have any exchange between the two hosts. One would ask a question, the other one would respond. It was kind of semi-set up, in their content, and we followed the same approach for the host-read ads. We'll play that.
Necessarily, following through with the sort of market threats, if you like, or the market fear of higher interest rates here.
Stay with me, Ray. We'll be back in a minute.
Sean, I want to talk about butterflies.
Oh, Michael, where's this going?
Well, every night while we're asleep, markets around the world are changing, and changes that can compound to make a big impact to us.
The butterfly effect. I'm with you.
Well, ANZ's global team of economists report those meaningful movements to the 5 in 5 with ANZ podcast to ensure you're on topic to start your day. This week, they're getting us up to speed on the latest from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, business and consumer confidence in Australia, and US CPI data for clues around when the Fed might cut.
So if you want their top 5 market developments in under 5 minutes, listen daily to the 5 in 5 with ANZ podcast in time for your first meeting.
Did you know...
So that's a little snapshot in a couple of the examples of the creative. They were 2 of probably 7 or 8 assets and multiple host-read ads that we made. But it really felt organic to the content. It was in both the advertising, the recorded advertising, as well as the host-read scripts. So that was the essence of the creative side. Helen, did you want to feedback any thoughts on that?
I think you've covered it. Look, it was a really interesting adventure for us. This was really new for ANZ. We hadn't done anything like this. Certainly haven't. I don't think we've done anything like this across the whole bank. So the idea of putting our brand in the hands of the hosts was, a bit confronting for a brand like us. But to just really trust that, and to, of course, with appropriate checks and balances, but to be able to just trust that and really kind of go with the advice was a huge learning for us. And as we started to see the numbers come in, which we'll talk to next, it became very obvious very quickly that we were onto something. It's very exciting.
Andy, do you want to pick up from the tracking?
So, yeah, I mean, the advantage of also having kind of the podcast as the product is that the results were all there in the back end. We had the data, day by day who was listening, how many new followers we were getting, how many downloads we were getting. So fortunately it went well, and Helen is here now still. But obviously our success metrics, as we said at the start, were more on increasing the followers and that regular audience. So whilst we obviously track the reach, and it's an important aspect still, because anyone hearing those ads is still being reminded of ANZ, they're still being informed of that expertise, but our real success was on the conversions. So yes, we have that information in the back end, but how are we tracking and measuring that throughout the course of the campaign so that we can work out, you know, which podcast individually or which network is delivering the best success in terms of listeners to the podcast and then followers. So I think in the previous presentation, you know, measurement seems to be a barrier in investment, which is just ridiculous in the podcast space, because what we have now in terms of tracking is really advanced. So we can track, even within the categories, which podcasts are driving the traffic, in this case, to our podcast. But that's the case for, you know, any campaign. You can even track leads and purchases now as well. So we're able to set up the tags to track podcast by podcast. But we also staggered the campaign month by month. So we could look at which flights or which activity was running in specific dates, and then in the back end, how many listeners or increased followers we were getting in that time. That allowed us to obviously put a cost on each one and work out as granular as cost per follower. And then if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to pull out one of the successful or the most successful podcast in the campaign was actually the one with the smallest audience. So there's a couple of stats on the screen there just to highlight how important these small podcasts still are. And there are lots of them in Australia, and they shouldn't be overlooked, because these smaller ones tend to have the most engaged, the most loyal audiences, and it tends to drive the most conversions as well. So before I hand over to Helen just to discuss the actual results, we'll just play this one as well so you can hear how authentic the ad also needs to be so that their audience isn't feeling fooled.
Investing Compass is a podcast we started to explore the fundamentals of investing and help you with achieving your financial goals, whatever they may be.
ANZ's 5 in 5 have sponsored this episode of Investing Compass. We also listen to 5 in 5 ourselves to keep up to date with the latest economic, markets, and business news each weekday. One of the things that we like about the podcast is that it has a similar approach to us. They leverage the insightful experts that they have across their global network to provide a rounded and level-headed analysis of news and insights each weekday.
You can find them in your preferred podcast player or click the link in the episode description to follow them and have a listen after us.
So, yes, I am still here, and we have expanded the campaign internationally now because of the kind of granular data that we have been able to identify through the skills of Andy in particular. The numbers here, like, it's really impressive, and you can see, you know, some of the data here. But if we just come back to that audience, these people do not suffer fools gladly. They've got no time, and you get it wrong once and you've had it. Yeah. So, like, helpful that our product is fantastic quality. We were never concerned about that. We knew we had the smarts, and we knew that there was organic uplift. So that part was very helpful. All I need to do is to get people listening and to understand that they're continuing to listen. And then we've struck gold, because we've got people who are building this into their daily lives, and it's taking me top of funnel. Now, if you're into marketing science and you're into B2B marketing science, you know that B2B customers are just like the rest of us. They've got a mental list of 1, 2, possibly 3, if we're lucky, brands for a particular product. And that's true if that product is a 100 million structured finance product, or if it's a breakfast cereal. It's kind of the same theory, yeah? And so my job is to make sure that we're in that mental 1, 2, or 3 for a client that might be worth $100 million to us in revenue in a year. So big numbers. You don't have to win many of them just for your ROI on your podcast campaign to stack up. Yeah. So that just gives you a sense of some of the metrics and the kind of numbers that we're working with here. And we were convinced very quickly that we were really onto something. And because of the granularity and how specific we were able to be, and we did make choices quickly along the way and look at different mixes and focus investment in different areas. That's really been the key to the success. So loads of learnings, a really interesting experience for us as a buyer. To embark on, a podcast in the first place, to embark on podcast advertising in the second place, and to have the kind of results that we have done. So I think that's all we've got for you. Not sure how we're doing for time, but we might have a couple of questions.
You're at time, but we've got a couple of questions coming through Slido, and we might grab one from the audience as well. Thank you for that. That was fantastic, sharing that information. I'll get rid of one first, because I think whoever wrote this is probably the person behind the company asking it. Who is making and producing the ANZ podcast? Is that in-house or is it external?
Yep, we can talk of.
Oh, and it's a combination of both, really. We've got the logistics. Our Bernard is based in New Zealand. He wakes up at 4 a.m. New Zealand time, which gives them a steal on the information, and it can be released in Australia by 6. So we have New Zealand production company spin-off working on that and facilitating that. So it's a very sort of efficient, tight machine. With any more to sum it up, I think.
Awesome. And I guess this is the sell-in bit, Helen. Like, what made you willing, excited, able to try something so new?
Good question. We like doing new things, so there's that. Look, I talk to this target audience a lot, and I'll give you an example. We do a lot. We run a lot of events. It's a real relationship business. So a lot of what we do in the marketing field is to bring CEOs, board members, CFOs, those kinds of people to thought leadership events where we can share the very best intelligence in an environment that facilitates them having conversations with each other and with our staff. Yes, that's a really big part. Sounds great. I spoke to one of them and he said to me, I probably get 200 invitations like this a year. Wow. And that's before you start with hobbies, family, life. Yeah, I was like, why did you? I could tell you why he came to us and not to the other ones, but that sort of just gave me an insight into the kind of ask that we're making of people to engage in our content in those sorts of ways. So we had to find something that works in people's lives every day, and maybe sending them another invitation, one of the 200, is not always the way. Yeah. So I was looking for a high frequency, low cost way of serving up our intel through channels that we hadn't already explored, and so the podcast, became a natural kind of area of interest for us. Honestly, when we started off, we had no idea whether this was a goer or not. It really was an experiment. Yeah. We did it really low key to start with.
Yeah, fantastic. Any questions from the floor? Heaps on Slido I can grab. Yep. Helen, the audience sounds slightly scary. The audience sounds slightly scary, these 4 a.m. warriors.
Morning, thanks. That was so interesting. It's so rare to see a finance brand do an actual case study that's open. On the different platforms you're on, are you able to see, of all the subscribers, how many are institutional and how many are retail investors, sort of at the end of the day?
You don't get that level of detail in the back end. It really is just, here's your unique listeners, downloads, followers per month. But again, that's why we want it to be so specific in the targeting, because we don't want random people listening to the podcast once or twice and then getting bored of it. So I think with the media plan that we had, we can be confident that anyone listening through is that target audience, based on common sense and the sort of podcast that we're appearing on. So you don't get that granular breakdown. You might get that in surveys that they do in ANZ, I'm not sure, but we definitely don't get that in the back end. It's not.
I might add to that. We have this idea of we've got the buyers, and then we've got buying parties. There's, the research would say that there's probably 15 people in our industry. It's probably more like 24 people influencing that purchase decision. Okay, so now we've got quite a big network, yeah. And if the average tenure of a transaction banking institutional customer is maybe 10 years, okay, now I'm thinking 10 years on. So this is a long game. So now my audience can afford to be, for a brand salience objective, can afford to be a bit more long-term than the CFO. Yeah. So I don't mind if I've got institutional investors, and I don't mind if I've got a really informed general public. It's not general public because you got to want to listen to this stuff, yeah. But you get the idea. So having that extension is not a bad thing when my cost per ear is really efficient. Now, if this were general public, it's irrelevant. They're not going to be interested. They're not going to come back. They're not going to stick around for 8 minutes. We're going to start to see it in the way that listening patterns emerge. It's not relevant. We've not got our targeting right. If people are sticking around for a full episode, I'm in, yeah? Because they might not be exactly today, but they could well be influencing in that larger buying party. And if not, well, if they're interested now, in a few years' time, they're going to be in those fields of employment somewhere because that's their jam. That's the way we're going about it. I don't know. Ask me again in 5 years.
We will.
Thank you
so